Hi, my name is Brandon, and I'm an alcoholic and addict in recovery. Today, I want to talk about death and accepting death as a reality, which has become a really important part of my recovery and something that I struggled with a lot in my active addiction and in the time before. So, I'm going to read a little bit from Going to Pieces Without Falling Apart by Mark Epstein, where he gives a couple of great examples of the consequences of not accepting death and what happens when we do. He says, several years after insulating the attic of his home, my grandfather developed a malignant tumor of the lungs that was caused by inhaling fragments of the newly marketed asbestos fibers that he was using. Treated at home for as long as possible, he received regular injections of morphine for his pain that my father, at the age of 16, learned to administer. Yet through all of this, he never told his wife what he knew, that he was dying. Protecting my grandmother from the pain of his own death, he never permitted her to hug him goodbye. Despite my grandfather's moral backbone and intellectual accomplishments, he was unable or unwilling to face the reality of his impending death with my grandmother. Perhaps he was attempting to protect her the way one wishes one could do for a child. My grandmother really never knew. She was left to struggle with feeling betrayed by the person whom she loved most in the world, and her pain, judging from the tears she shed 50 years later as she told me her story, had not abated in the interim. The next story he tells is about the Buddha, and he says, in the story of the Buddha's life, there was a similar situation. After his mother's death in childbirth, the Buddha-to-be grew up in a royal household in which any hints of old age, illness, or death were prohibited by his father's decree. Suckled by wet nurses and raised in the most privileged surroundings of his day, young Gautama was kept isolated from any whisper of death. Out riding in the countryside one day, he chanced upon an old person, a sick person, and a corpse, sights he had never before seen. The feelings aroused in him by these sights were so disturbing that they prompted him to forsake all that his father had created for him. He left his palace and his family, and began a search for peace of mind. He later called these images of old age, illness, and death the three messengers that awaken people to the spiritual life. So early in life, I remember very early in life being terrified of death, because a lot of young children are. It's a very difficult thing to accept the idea that one day you're here, the next day you're not. I also experienced death fairly early in my life. And as a member of the church, it was common to talk about people who had died. The idea was very scary for someone who was young, who was just starting to even form a concept of what life was. But when I was introduced to the idea of the possibility of an afterlife, of heaven and hell, and while I was able to use that to soothe me for a period of time, I also then became terrified that I wouldn't end up in the good place and lived a life of fear based on that. So my actions in life, as I used the idea of an afterlife to soothe my fear of death, my actions also grew out of fear that I wouldn't end up in the right afterlife or in the pleasant one. And so then I got to a point in life where I rejected my religious beliefs, and all hell broke loose. I lost my moral compass because I lost that fear of going to a bad place after death. And I lived a life based on fulfilling the needs of the self. But I still wasn't accepting the reality of death. I was still rejecting the reality of death by living like it couldn't happen to me. I didn't exercise, I ate poorly, and I drank and smoked cigarettes, all these things that I knew were killing me slowly. But I rejected that idea. It's not going to happen today. It's not going to happen today. And It wasn't until I accepted death as an inevitability and even went further to embrace it as a defining characteristic of life that I found an ultimate freedom in life that's been extremely important for me in recovery. Once I accepted that death could happen at any moment, that it could be the cause of damage I'd done to my own body, it could be the cause of a stray meteorite crashing through the ceiling, could be the cause of some freak accident, it could be something totally out of my control, but that death could happen at any moment. It wasn't until I accepted that I really found some freedom. Because at that point, choices that I would have agonized over for days all of a sudden became clear. Thoughts and fears that I used to would have obsessed about for days faded away. And I was able to start to shake off the burden of ego and pride that really drove a lot of the fears that I had about life. And the things that had that ego and pride had me longing for immortality, and instead start to happily accept that the next moment I might no longer exist. And I truly mean that. I happily accept that and be okay with the fact that I might not be here at any moment in the given future. And this acceptance allowed me the freedom to move comfortably into a life of service, peace, serenity. And this has been an important aspect of my recovery. Once I accepted the inevitability of death, then I was able to move toward a more value-based way of living, where I could say, okay, well, if I'm going to die at any moment, then what makes the most sense is to just find the values that are important to me, live by those values, and focus on what is the important thing for me to do next. Because I'm not even guaranteed to get to do that thing. I don't even know if I'm going to get to the moment where I get to do that thing. So all I need to focus on is what happens next. Doesn't mean I don't plan for the future, because a lot of times that's the appropriate thing to do next. But accepting that future might never happen makes it easier to decide what should be done next. And so my message for today is make peace with death. Everybody has to do this in their own way. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you shouldn't believe in an afterlife or you shouldn't believe in heaven and hell. Everybody has to find their own way to make peace with death. But I think it's an incredibly important part of life, and especially for those of us in recovery, this fear of death creates a fear-based way of living. And in order for us to move out of fear, we really have to accept that at any moment we could stop existing. And when you do accept that, choices in the moment start to become more clear. The way you want to live your life starts to become more clear. And you're just given the opportunity to be more at peace, because once you accept the inevitability of the way life ends, it's a lot easier to just exist while it's here. That's it for today. Hope you have a good one. I'll be back here tomorrow with more.